you have security engineers who spot this thing and they don't know what it is. And so they uninstall it and take it into their forensics lab to figure out what it's doing. And then, of course, hilarity ensues.
Tell me who you are and what's your area of specialty.
So my name is Matthew O'Connor. I'm a technical director with Google Cloud's Office of the CTO. I focus on security, privacy, compliance, and regulatory issues. And I have an affinity for very large-scale software services.
Now, I know you've spent many years at Google focusing on security. And over the past few of those years, you've been working with some of the top leaders from the largest and most complex regulated companies and organizations in the world. Now, over that time, what patterns have emerged and become clear to you that would produce a set of advice you'd like to share with all CTOs and CIOs?
A couple things. One is complexity is an enemy of security. And so if you're able to take a systems view of what you're doing and can influence that to be simple, if you're looking at it through a security lens, that could help you have a much better outcome. And it's difficult. It's very difficult, especially when you have tens or hundreds of vendors and different products and different thoughts on how things should be protected, and if stuff's not maintained, just all kinds of problems can arise. But working really hard to keep things consistent and simple pays dividends in the long run. A piece of advice that I would give a CIO or a CISO, if the company's large enough to have a CISO, is that there's kind of a trite saying in security: you either have had a breach or you don't know that you're breached yet. To that end, what I would recommend is that you really understand who in your company is going to respond if you have an incident. And I would go as far as to actually practice that. But you want to do that at least once, so that when you do have that incident, whatever it is, however big or small it might be, you don't have to invent your process as you're going along, because it's much better if you have a playbook. Your playbook might be wrong, and it might be wrong at the time you go to implement it. But if you have something to start with versus nothing to start with, you're in a much better position. I think probably the third thing that I would recommend, and I think that everybody should be looking at this, is that phishing is a technique that can be very successful. Most of the widely known about breaches have resulted of some employee being phished and giving up their credentials. And there's been a lot of work and a lot of research that's gone on in this area. And there's actually tools that can help you a lot to resolve this issue. And the primary one I think you should focus on is WebAuthn-based two-factor authentication. So at Google, we call them security keys. And we have given these to all of our employees. And we've mitigated phishing as an attack vector very successfully by using these. And the nice thing about it is that the WebAuthn standard is being widely embraced. Apple has started to include the capabilities in their iPhones, and it's available in some of the Android phones, which have trusted processing units. And so you start to get into a situation where you can offer this second factor authentication without actually even having to provide your employees with additional devices. So it starts to make the migration cost quite low. It becomes procedural. There's some software integration work that needs to be done, but I would suggest that is an investment worth making. just because the overall investment you might make there in your enterprise is quite possibly lower cost than the breach that could occur if you don't do this.
So for those that are thinking through their mind, okay, second factor authentication, I already have that. I have an authenticator app on my phone and I put in a code in addition to putting in username and password. Isn't that good enough? What guidance would you offer somebody who's thinking that?
I would say that each of those technologies has been a significant milestone on the path to better and better authentication. But with anything that you put into the field and get into enough hands, there's somebody out there who is determined to break it. And there have been proven attacks against those methods of two-factor authentication. While some of them are quite difficult and require some real effort to pull off, it's not impossible to still phish your users if you're using those techniques. And the WebAuthn based authentication uses a separate channel to do the validation, and it requires the attacker to have control of a lot of the user's facilities. They actually have to be in front of the computer that they're making the request from. They also have to know, the user's credentials, and you can't. And because it requires a physical interaction, you can't do a replay attack like you can with an SMS code, where you can intercept that and then replay it. So it just makes it significantly more difficult to phish the user, even if your phishing is really first rate. And there's some really motivated adversaries out there that go to great lengths to make their login screens look a lot like your login screens.
So I know, through your years at Google, you've been with some folks who like to have fun, and I'd like you to share with me a story from your memory. Like, what is the funniest thing that you can remember?
I actually have two. One is, security people. A lot of people get into the field of security because they hack things. They like puzzles. They like tricks. They're very curious. They take things apart. And then they find out you can do this with computers and computer software and really get into it. And in fact, we have a vulnerability rewards program that pays bug bounties for people who find bugs and help us fix things. And it's been very successful for Google. But many years ago, so one of the things that happens at Google is Google will, on occasion, move businesses around in their facilities and change buildings. And they're actually, the growth of the company's been pretty tremendous over the last couple of years, and that's happening less and less because they just build new facilities. So they're not relocating people. But several years back, early in the days of Google Cloud, we were on a campus in Mountain View that was a four building office complex, and the security team, the Google core security team, was put on the fourth floor of a building, and it was really fun because they decorated the building and it had a security theme, and the team was very excited to move in there, and part of the reason that they were put up on the fourth floor is so that, like, if you didn't have any business being up there, you didn't need to be up there. Well, the interesting thing is that on the second and the third floors of this building was the Google Cloud sales organization. So, and a sales organization and a security organization are kind of like at the two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of types of people that work in these organizations. And so one of the folks in the security team decided he was going to have a little bit of fun, and he installed a sign on one of the parking spaces right in front of the building that said "Employee of the Month," and he parked in it. He used it as his own parking space because nobody else would park in there. And then he also He also set up an internal website that explained that it was indeed the Employee of the Month parking spot. Um, and the funny thing is that you have all these salespeople who are motivated by doing a good job and wanting to do a good job and be measured by that, and they could never figure out how they could win the Employee of the Month. Because they figured if they, did good job and did good deals and stuff, they would win. Um, and this went on for a couple years before anybody really caught on. And I would hazard to bet that that sign is probably still there. I don't know if it's been removed. I haven't been over there in a couple years, but it was very, very
Describe the sign for me. Like, what were its physical characteristics?
Oh, it was a legitimate metal like street traffic sign, probably a foot wide by 18 inches tall. Done with a reflective coating and contrasting letters on it. Like a no parking sign, but it said Employee of the Month. And we have other signs up in the parking lot for like disabled parking spots, or I think they set aside parking for expectant mothers. People who don't shouldn't have to walk very far, and also carpool spots. They have signs set up, so it was same spec and same color as those signs, and it was put on the 3-inch diameter metal pole. He poured concrete and set it into the ground. I mean, I think he did it probably on a Saturday morning when nobody was around, and just had fun with it for a couple of years. And he would watch people walking by the sign, and he would just have a good laugh at their expense. Um, the second story, or the other story, or a different one, in this same building, in this building that had the security team in it, we Google's a data-driven company. We gather data to do all kinds of things. For example, we provide lunch to our employees, but we still have a badge reader so that we count the number of people who come to lunch. So we know, we can build up a history, and know that there's more people there for lunch on Wednesdays than there is on Fridays. And the team that runs our facilities at Google is called RUSE. It's an acronym, and I can't even tell you what it stands for. But they run our facilities, and they take care of all kinds of things like managing the food service and the custodial service and the build out of the buildings. And if you have problems with your desk, they're the people that'll fix it for you and things like that. And they are always looking for ways to use data to drive their decision making and to do a better job. And so at one point, they had decided to experiment with some sensors. And so they had built a sensor that used an Android phone to monitor the paper towels in the men's room. And they installed this on the ceiling in the men's room in the security building, but did not tell any of the inhabitants of the building what they were doing. And there was no sign that says, "Hey, nothing to see here. This is looking at paper towels and make it." And so, of course, you have security engineers who spot this thing, and they don't know what it is. And so they uninstall it and take it into their forensics lab to figure out what it's doing. And then, of course, hilarity ensues as they figure out what this is and find out who owns it. And so I think the policy did change, that you have to be a little bit more clear when you install these sensors. But you can imagine the level of excitement when the security team is finding a device that they've never seen before and they don't know anything about in their workspace. So, albeit it was in the men's room, it was still in their space. So that one was another kind of funny security story.
So we worked together on the public-facing response to the Spectre meltdown vulnerability crisis. First of all, could you kind of sum up for us what that vulnerability was all about? Why it was so scary and why it was so hard to fix?
One attack vector that concerns many in the security community is what's known as a side channel attack. And the environment that um, sets up a side channel attack is having a system that has more than one user on it. And what the side channel means is that let's assume we've got user A and user B. User A is the normal user. User B is the malicious user, the attacker. And they're both using the same system. And in a side channel attack, the malicious user, user B, would use characteristics or flaws in the system to observe what user A is doing. Many years ago, when modern microprocessors were starting to be built, there was a design decision made. And the design, there was, like any technology, there are trade-offs and benefits and decisions that get made. And sometimes decisions that get made are very foundational, and they are going to be part of the lifespan of something forever or decades. And so early in the life cycle of modern microprocessors, a decision was made to employ an architecture called speculative execution. And what speculative execution was, in a multitasking computer, what the computer's trying to do is guess ahead on what you're intending to do to speed up your transactions, to speed up the computation that you're trying to do. And when you start to introduce other users, there's been a concern that the other user of the system could learn about what the original user's doing by making these observations. And so there was a flaw in the architecture, the speculative execution architecture, which enabled this attack to occur. And so one of our researchers discovered this and reported it appropriately to the manufacturers of the microprocessors. So excuse me there, and there's a bunch of processors, a bunch of processes that these companies go through to fix these problems, but the biggest problem that you run into is, can we resolve this issue? Can we resolve it in a timely fashion, and can we do it so that we can secure the systems back up, so that multiple users can use the same processors? Because part of the promise of cloud computing is to be able to share a commodity resource so that you can get better scalability, because you can harness more of them, but you can also get a lower cost because you're not getting 100%. You don't have to own the device yourself to get benefit from it. And in the times when you're not using it, the cloud provider that owns the device can let somebody else use it. And there's some situations where multiple users can be using it, because modern microprocessors are very capable, can support lots of things going on at the same time. And this is how you get the real economy of scale, and one of the real promises of cloud computing. And so we had a grave concern that this vulnerability would be fatal and would cause us to have to, dedicate processors to individual users, and then do a setup or tear down process between each user doing the jobs. And so you can imagine that if you just think about adding 10% more, you're just adding inefficiency to the process. And so there was a concern industry-wide that this vulnerability would make it difficult to actually achieve the promise of cloud. but through the work of many people and many companies, working together to resolve these issues, the vulnerability was able to be fixed in software, and made available to all of the processors that are currently deployed and out in the world, so that people could patch up this vulnerability and continue to be safe and secure in their computing.
What lesson do you think, if you were to pick one top lesson learned from this, what lesson do you think Google learned from that experience?
It's not if, it's when. And the scale of this vulnerability was it affected every processor deployed. So it was basically, you could think about that as infinite scale. I think if you went and looked at the chip manufacturers, they could probably tell you how many processors they've manufactured over time, or maybe they won't, because that might be a number they don't want to share. But um, let's safely assume there are billions of microprocessors that this affected. Um, and so while we have dealt with other incidents, and we actually even practice our incident management and incident response, um, this issue was huge, and it required a lot of people to be involved. It was not negotiable. I mean, we had to work on this. We had to solve this problem because it was important to our business and it was important to our customers. Um, and the same for and this thinking was shared across the industry. And so even when you think you're prepared, I think there's still lessons to be learned. There's still the potential for more work to do. Um, and I also think that because there tends to be fairly good cooperation across the security community. There was good industry cooperation here because everybody was in the soup together, and nobody wanted anybody to be unsuccessful in getting through this problem. So it was kind of refreshing. It was good. I mean, it was terrible that we had the problem, but it was good that industry worked together and resolved this issue, and our customers and our common customers could be rest assured that the best and brightest worked on it and worked really hard to come up with a good solution and deliver that to everybody.
We're seeing companies adopting open source more than ever. Why do you think that's happening?
I think it's happening for a couple reasons. One, I think there's um, some really good reasons it's happening, and I think there's some not so good reasons it's happening. I think the not so good reason that it's happening is that in some situations there's an assumption that the use of open source is free, um, as in kind of free lunch. And someone famously said there is no free lunch, and the same applies to open source. Um, but on the other hand, um, I think I think the collaborative nature of open source has really opened a lot of people's eyes on, um, industrial robust solutions can be uh, built using open source software. And there are some really nice characteristics of open source software. One, in some situations, there's licensing terms which enable you to modify the software. And so if you go buy commercial off-the-shelf software that only meets 90% of your requirements, you're beholden to your vendor to close the gap on those 90% of the requirements, or you hire consultants to, write the glue software that solves those requirements, or your own IT people do that. But if you use open source software, you can actually collaborate with the community to add those features. Maybe your engineers do it firsthand. Maybe you just put a request to the community and it appears. And the interesting thing about that is that because you're doing that out in the open, there's other people that might be using that software that have that same issue. They need to integrate with that same device, or they need to, they need the same functionality. And so you might have a couple different companies that are able to collaborate on that. Um, the other things and so you can fix the software yourself to do what you want it to do. And the people that are best at that do that, and then they contribute that back to the community that owns that piece of open source. Own is kind of a weird word to use in the terms of open source, but the top open source projects have communities that run them, own them. They are the organization that builds and maintains these things. And if you contribute back, it's good. It's goodness. It helps that community in the whole. There's some other interesting characteristics that you have with open source too, in that you can inspect all the code, you can read through the code, you can really understand what it's doing, and there's all kinds of different benefits you get from that. Obviously, you get a security benefit because you can audit the code yourself, and if you're smart enough to do that and have the expertise, that person works for you that can do that, then they can do that for you. There's plenty of people that you can hire, third parties, to give you a third party perspective on that as well. And so if you have those kinds of concerns, you can address them yourself. You can also tailor the software and make it smaller. Maybe you want the software to run on older machines that aren't quite as capable as the newest machines. And so you can actually do the performance work, or you can take out the libraries or the modules that you don't need to accomplish what you're doing, but and help you get the performance characteristic that you want. The other thing is that if we go back to the open source communities, there's some of them that actually have members in them that are, like the world expert in that particular piece of software is a contributor to that community. And so if you use that piece of software, it's almost better than hiring them. And you may not be able to hire them because they might be gainfully employed by somebody else, or this open source community might have, a funding source that gives that person a full-time salary and they're completely happy with that role that they've got. But you get to take advantage of that expertise, and you get to take advantage of the community. And and quite honestly, if you look at it in business terms, another famous cliche, time is money. If there's an open source package that solves a problem that you think your IT organization needs to write a piece of software with or for, like, if you're in a decision making role and you choose to have your team write it from the ground up, you're working harder than you need to, and it's going to take you longer to get it done. So in many situations, you'd be better served to take that open source package that meets 90% of your requirements and have your team focus on that last 10% to meet 100% of your requirements, and then contribute that back to the community. But you'd probably get to accomplishing your mission faster than you would have previously. And then I think the other thing is, quite honestly, is that the open source ecosystem has grown, and there's a lot more stuff available there than there was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And some of it's really excellent software. And so if you're not familiar with this, I encourage you to dive in and learn about it. And if you are familiar with this and you've got something on your roadmap that you need to solve, peruse the catalogs, see if there's a solution that's already there, see if there's something close. You might be surprised. You might be pleasantly surprised, especially if you haven't looked in a long time. If your universe of open source is SendMail, a lot's changed. You'll be pleasantly surprised.
Matt, thanks so much for joining me today and having this conversation. I look forward to having you back sometime.
It's my pleasure. Let me take a sip of water. Got my cloud mug. Repping. That's for Erica.